Today, I'm delighted to welcome Jason Scheckner, Senior Director of Business Strategy at Workday HiredScore, to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Jason, welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Before we dive in, for those who may not be familiar, could you start by giving us a quick introduction to yourself and to HiredScore?
Love to. And first of all, David, thanks for having me on behalf of Workday and HiredScore to share what we're up to. So my background has been really back to 2008. I joined the HR tech ecosystem. I did my first startup back then. I've since done 2 or 3 other companies in the startup space, 2 of which were also HR tech focused. So vast majority of my career, this Workday is now my 4th company that's in the HCM space. But most excitingly and relevant to this conversation, I joined HiredScore as the 11th employee back in 2017. So when I joined, again, very small number of employees. I think we had 3 or 4 customers at that point. So really early in the go-to-market life cycle. And my focus really when I joined and agreed to sign up with Athena was really about how do we take the story to market about what we're working on, the challenges the HR facing, how AI can help solve those. And it was really early. So we built out the go-to-market side. That includes sales, marketing, customer partnerships. And then in my last 2 years, really, David, last time we connected, I was in a role called a chief business officer. And that was really focused on the intersection of our customers, our partnerships, and actually our innovation. And so I got to work across our customer base, focused on really sort of what were the big challenges they were solving, how AI could unlock those. So got to travel really all across the country, world, sitting with our customers, focused on the next generation of their transformation initiatives. And then this spring we were acquired by Workday, which has been a really exciting transition. And then have since then moved into a role called Senior Director of Business Strategy, which again largely focuses on how a HiredScore can connect to the Workday ecosystem. So that's me. It's been a fun journey, and excited to be with you today.
And as you said, a big, particularly big year for you and the HiredScore team becoming part of the Workday family.
Yeah.
I was actually at Workday Rising a few weeks ago in Las Vegas. I know you were there, and I know you're doing the rounds on the conference circuit at the moment. Workday Rising, Unleash, HR Tech, and
This is the season.
It is it's the season to be jolly, maybe, but maybe not so jolly with all the air travel. I can definitely subscribe to that. And certainly I saw at Workday Rising, a real buzz, obviously about HiredScore as well. So kudos to you and the team for bringing that into the Workday family. And I know a lot of the focus on your talks has been around talent orchestration being the next evolution of talent intelligence. I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. Could you share a little bit more about what talent orchestration is for our listeners and how that builds on the foundation of talent intelligence?
Yeah, of course. And yeah, Rising was amazing. I mean, it was just as a side note, I mean, having been to it in the past as a partner was one thing, but to go as an employee and sort of be on that side of it, it was really an amazing event. So, but yeah, I think your question around talent orchestration, again, we made a really important decision about 3 or 4 years ago when the market talent intelligence started to emerge. And there's this really tough decision around, did we want to become a system of record? A lot of our clients were happy with us and they said, well, maybe you could build some of the functionality that some of these other companies are working on. And there's no shortage of those, solutions. And I give credit to Athena, really, and our team. We decided that the world didn't need another system of record. And really what we were going to focus on was leveraging the systems customers already have, and connecting to that data, connecting to those processes, the systems, and leveraging that data rather than giving them another system and putting that back to work for the customer. And so if we think of talent intelligence, David, it's sort of been this all-encompassing catch-all for everything from skills to CRMs to talent marketplaces and a whole bunch of other things. And a great, great examples are what they're achieving is bringing AI insights or automation into the ecosystem often. So no problem with talent intelligence overall. I think it was the natural evolution from where platforms were. But where talent orchestration takes the next step is it's really about outcomes. So insights are great, automation's great, but at the end of the day, we care about, are we fundamentally changing the way that businesses are driving talent? And so in order to do that, you have to connect to multiple systems really well. You have to understand different data types. You have to understand various personas, policies, procedures, and then ultimately you have to tie that back to a business objective. And so when you do that successfully, you go really beyond the insights into the outcomes phase, which is what I was talking about. And so maybe a practical example is, talent intelligence in the world of talent intelligence, an employee, for instance, would have to go to a talent marketplace. They'd have to input their skills or upload information. And once they did that, they might get an insight about jobs that they could possibly move to in a few years. Okay, great. And I think a lot of companies were excited about that. And that's a cool feature and functionality, and employees got excited about it. Orchestration, example of how it's an evolution, is without the employee telling me anything, I can consume all the data across the system. So I can take your HCM data, I can take any skills data, your talent profile, learning data, even application data on the other side of systems. I can unify them. I can meet the employee where they are in a system like Microsoft Teams. So I don't even need them to go into a platform. I can understand all the mobility rules, policies, procedures around moving, fully understand compliance, GDPR, all the fun privacy regulations, and give them recommendations that are highly relevant without them having to give me more information. So I'm achieving the outcome, but I didn't need something else to get there. And it's an outcome in the form of the employee, for instance, moving to a new role. So it's my best way of kind of giving a practical example of how orchestration is a bit different, but there's countless use cases across the enterprise. And now that we're part of Workday, I think even broader things that we can do beyond what we were doing before.
Really interesting. Really strikes, the insight versus outcomes. There's a great quote from Pia Schmither, who was the head of people analytics at Johnson & Johnson at the time. I heard at a conference, and he just said, "Insight without outcome is overhead," which I think is quite relevant for us, that we all get very excited about our insights sometimes, but if no one takes action on it and it doesn't lead to a business outcome, then there's arguably it's nice, but it doesn't have the impact that we want to have as well. So,
That's right.
So listening to you, Jason, so talent orchestration, it isn't just about optimizing individual processes. It's about connecting all those pieces of the jigsaw around the HR systems and data together. I mean, how does this differ from the likes of data lakes and system of records?
Yeah. So again, I think we're fundamentally rely on systems of record. And again, now part of Workday, that's a little bit more obvious because we sit on top of Workday systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things we're planning to do there. But even prior to that, again, we were system agnostic, David, as you know. So we were connecting to all the major players in the market. Pretty much, if you think of what types of systems an F500 kind of company might have, generally we were connecting to most of them. And so for a system of records, HiredScore didn't exist because we weren't a system record. By making that decision, we needed, by definition, the systems of records. So they had to have an ATS, they had to have an HCM, they had to have a learning system, a VMS, whatever we were connecting to, CRM, et cetera. So we're fully supportive of those. I think the one question mark, we could talk a little bit more, was really in the phase we're in, does a customer need point solutions for all those things? Is the best of breed actually a better decision as we start to look at this data islands problem that we've identified in the market? But either way, our job wasn't to tell them which to pick. It was, if they did pick them, how do we pull all that together? I think the question around data lakes is a little different. Again, it's not an either or. So it's not an orchestration or a data lake. A data lake in many ways serves a really different purpose. It's not about action. Again, going back to this kind of actions and outcomes, it's really not about actions. You're moving data into a data lake so it can be more easily combined, offer easier endpoints for integration, access, potentially solve different vendors not touching your core systems for security and other reasons. But you still need to build an application or workflow on top of that data to execute the process. So what's great about orchestration is I don't need to then build another workflow on top of Workday or your ATS system. I can take the data inside those. But again, that could be in the ATS. Theoretically, I guess it could be in a data lake as long as there's strong APIs and data flow. But we're creating the action by understanding the processes and then driving, connecting to, like, let's say a hiring manager, for example, wants to understand if their employee might be eligible for a movement and what roles they could move to. That in data lake world, even if you had a data lake, that doesn't really help the manager. They're not going to go scour the data lake for, with some sort of search mechanism. So you still have to make it simple for them to ask the question called, hey, can David move to a new role, and what are those roles? And so those are the kinds of things we're orchestrating. So lakes are generally, again, to be clear, I'm not for or against them. I just would say they're great for research, storage, and needed when you don't have generally good API enabled platforms, which is another major issue they're solving for. So again, generally understand why they exist, and for us, we don't need them because of, again, our depth of integrations. Typically, we're not opposed to them by any means.
So it sounds like, because let's be honest, many organizations, their HR tech ecosystem has kind of evolved over the years, and for whatever reason they've got what they've got, and in some cases they would have spent a lot of time and money implementing these solutions. And what it sounds like you're doing with talent orchestration is you're actually meeting the individual organization where they are, and through your technology helping them in a way get the most out of their investments without any major resurgery. Is that kind of where you would say you were?
Yeah, and I don't know how many consultants or SIs are listening to your podcast, but in theory, some of the orchestration means that they don't have to re-optimize their system to achieve the next business objective, right? So if their workflow that they've built is what it is, normally to go to the next business change, or let's say the business goals change, I might need to change. I might need to modify the workflow. I might need to change permissions. I might need to institute new policies. Orchestration simplifies a lot of that. So I can coordinate that down. If the business, let's just say we go from, hiring surplus, excuse me, to hiring freeze, that's a tough thing for companies to adjust to. But in orchestration, you can just change the SLA and focus for the recruiters and what they're targeted with, and you can drive that down through orchestration. So I don't need to reinvent the systems. I don't need to rethink the business processes or anything like that. As a simple example. So, and that's a practical one because, again, HR objectives shift quite often. But again, it's how do I connect back to the business management? The other thing that orchestration we're seeing does is it takes a lot of the change management hassle out of the equation. That falls on HR to, for instance, a great example there's a lot of HR processes are driven through non-HR personas. So think of like the manager, the employee, but HR doesn't own those individuals, right? So how do you get them to adhere to the policies, procedures if they're not, required to do so? And so orchestration can do that really well. So if I meet a user in Teams, it's a very UI-less experience. I can update policies, procedures in real time. And if they're opening a new role next week, it'll remind them what the new policy procedure is related to their role. So I don't have to reteach that, re-roll out new training and things like that. I can easily integrate that into the process.
And then the other thing you mentioned was data islands. Love you to talk through that concept a little bit for our listeners, and listening to you, what I'm assuming that talent orchestration does is it help provides a bridge between some of those islands.
Yeah. So that actually, I think Ernest on our team. Ernest had done a really great body of work. He'd come over from Salesforce, leading their people science and data analytics team, and he did a great body of work. What I had said is, we're connected to all these systems. It'd be interesting perspective for us as this kind of system agnostic, orchestration layer to understand, like, what is the efficacy rates of these various tools? So a customer might have 5 different systems of record that they invest in. What does that actually mean? And so we found some fascinating data. And again, this isn't published, to be clear, but these are our general stats we're comfortable sharing across our customers. And we're finding things like, and most of these are corroborated by other analysts in the community that have done similar research, less than 30% of users were going into the CRM. So again, it's not mean a CRM is a bad tool. can have great value, but the average customer weren't getting users to adopt it. And then you take a further look, and 50% or more of the data was redundant from the applicant tracking system, which meant that you had very few people using it, and the majority of the data was an overlay or overlap, I should say, of the prior data. So then we start to ask ourselves, well, what is the value where little people use and the limited data, right? So that's a fascinating question. And then you start to look at the talent marketplaces where, those, David, were a lot about how do we get employees to find flex work or gigs or, different things like this, mentors. Great ideas, love them. But again, when you look at the efficacy rate, we're seeing less than 20% of people. Actually, I think it was down to 12% of people actually going to the talent marketplace proactively. Skills is another interesting one, right? The skills is everywhere, but less than 20% of employees proactively updating their skills. Some companies do much better at it. Trust me, they have great initiatives, but generally in the marketplace. And so you have all these investments, and I'm just kind of highlighting, and that, I'm not getting even to the contingent worker and the difference between the data types and the fact that one sits in procurement and one sits in HR and the challenges there. But we're just seeing fascinating disconnects between these data and understanding, and then the utilization rates of these tools. And so, you start to ask yourself a question: even if the platform has less functionality than the point solution, but I get most people to use it, am I better off than if I have more features, but I get less people to use them? I'm not an expert here, David, but there's a math equation there that probably answers that to some extent. And so I would guess in most cases, less is actually more. And so we started to see some fascinating things there with these data islet problems. Not only that, but your cost of ownership is higher, your project deployment costs, your success rate of those deployments is risky. So there's some fascinating things. But yeah, this is the market we work in, and there's a lot of great vendors out there. It doesn't mean they're doing a bad job. It's just organizations struggle with getting sort of the results out of all these things, which is what we start to see.
And I'm sure some of those challenges you've highlighted and some of those adoption rates you've highlighted will resonate with many of our listeners, I suspect, in their companies. Jason, one of the data points you highlighted from, I think it was from BCG at your recent presentation at Workday Rising, which really resonated with me, was that 89% of executives rank AI as a top priority, but only 34% are happy with their progress. So there's quite a gap there between expectation and reality, I guess. Why do you think companies are struggling to make real strides with AI, and how can talent orchestration help bridge that divide?
So it's actually really fascinating. On one hand, we have to applaud companies because they are trying to experiment, right? So because of the AI, what we saw in the last few years with the absolute wave of AI technology and sort of the early easy access, the entry point to AI became easier with ChatGPT and everything else. We saw really a great way that companies could start working on these different projects. So on one hand, I want to say that's great, and we should encourage and applaud that. The challenge that we're seeing is where companies are choosing to experiment is sometimes counterintuitive. Meaning, if I'm a pharmaceutical company, it's great for me to deploy AI use cases for things like drug development or drug release or something like that, because I understand how that's going to impact my business and drive outcomes, et cetera. But what you end up having happen is you've got, different engineers and things like that. And so when they put together a list of experiments, like I had one customer that, and again, it was a cool initiative. They said, I want every department to come up with, several ideas for how AI can be deployed in their department. And so, HR comes up with a few great ideas. They bring it to the committee, and the committee says, we can build that. And so you get people building in a domain that they don't have expertise. And so what you often get is you get a POC that works or looks good. Like, I can, write a job, or I can write this thing, or I can, synthesize this information, whatever it is with these large LLMs that they have access to. But they don't anticipate the scale challenges of that. And that is really where the rubber hits the road. So, in HR, you have things like compliance, you have global regulations, you have, the need to adapt to different languages and for different user experiences. You have different, the data types are fascinating, because once they get into the weeds of, the data, even in Workday, by the way, Workday is an amalgamation of a HCM platform, a recruiting platform, now a contingent platform, which is great. You have one platform and one data structure, but there's still different object types, and so I still have to connect to different APIs. And so there's that, and then just the amount of processing that has to happen to make that work. There's understanding the workflows and processes, obviously the compliance and all the regulatory shifts that are happening and keeping that up to speed. And so I think particularly HR, I guess my point is they don't anticipate, and I imagine this is similar in places like finance and other highly regulated areas, but unless you're an expert at that, anticipating all those challenges, you probably don't foresee those. And I think that's in HR in particular why companies will experiment, or they, like you have the Amazon case from whatever it is, it's now old, I think 2018, but where they publish the findings where they do these things and then they run into bias issues and other things like that and then abandon the projects. So I think that's one major thing, just the difficulty and the lack of understanding of what's going to come up. And then I think the other thing is we're still in an economic global environment that requires, sort of prudence in terms of how we spend our money and getting results. And so if you balance experimentation with like cost outcomes, it's a tough environment, meaning like there's not a lot of appetite to keep going with experimentation if we're not getting business outcomes. And so I think that pressure also means the experiments don't have time to maybe progress to a point of value, because if it's not giving me something, get rid of it, work on something else. So there's less desire. And this is why orchestration is great, because we've already done the legacy R&D that's so hard to connect all the systems and the objects and the workflows and the policies and the rules, and it already reads all that. So instead of having all that barrier, we can get right to the hard stuff and then start actually experimenting beyond that. And so we've got customers now that are on their third, fourth, fifth AI use case, and they're starting to come to us with problems and saying, hey, could we orchestrate this? Which I love to hear.
Yeah, and I guess it's the same with everything, isn't it? When it's a new shiny thing, for want of a better phrase, it's about, but let's apply it to a real business challenge that we've got. So as you said, that in a period where maybe many organizations are careful about what they're experimenting on and they want to see the value from it, if we connect AI to some of the business challenges that we're trying to solve as organizations, then we're more likely to see some impact from it and some value from it, and then we can invest more as we move forward.
Yeah, and one other thing I've observed is even if you go beyond the customers, and so they have their own initiatives, right? And then even if you look at whether it's the co-pilots or all the different models that are coming out, so customers have their own LLMs. You've got obviously quite a bit of generative AI in the areas of the vendor ecosystems. But what we're seeing actually is that a lot of the functionality that's coming out are addressing, and they're good use cases. Again, I want to be clear. I don't want to knock any of the technology. I think it's awesome. But it's addressing things like, writing a job, or can I better synthesize interview notes, or can I find an answer to an employee's question easily? I love all that stuff. But I will say the following. When you look at it on a transformation scale, let's just say it's a huge company. Maybe they're writing 5,000, 10,000 job descriptions a year. But at an employee level, you or I, David, might do that once or twice. So it's nice. And that one time I do have to write a job, it could be better. But in terms of changing how I work every day, it's probably not fundamentally transforming the organization outcome. I'm not saying if you add up those increments over a bunch of different tasks, that isn't valuable, maybe 1% to 3% gains, but it's not transforming an entire way a role works. And so again, I think that's where we see the sort of scale of impact is much more significant as we look at some of these deeper augmentations or disruptions in the orchestrations. That's our early observation so far. And it ties back to, again, that outcome of that pressure to have the initiatives actually deliver value. That's where you also see a disconnect, I think.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense when you put it. That's a great example, actually. In a large organization, as you said, you're probably only working on 1 or 2 job descriptions a year. So, as you said, it's nice, but as an individual, it doesn't make a huge lot of difference. So,
yeah,
interesting. Let's think about talent orchestration, and in the kind of areas of employee retention and internal mobility, because I know these are two areas which are a big focus for, I think,
Huge.
for you and the team, but also for a lot of the companies that we're working with. You know, tell us a little bit about that. What does talent orchestration mean in those two areas? And if you're able to share some case studies, I think that would really help listeners really kind of see the opportunities there.
Yeah, of course. So what's exciting about this, and this is actually where I think the combination of like Workday plus HiredScore is very exciting, because Workday already had solutions like they have a module called Talent Optimization, which sits on top of Core HCM, and so it's got functionality like their Career Hub and their Flex teams, and you can attach learning in there and other things that performance and manager insights, and so there's a variety of successions in there. There's all sorts of great things that are already packaged in there, again, for the manager, for the employee to build on top of the great stuff that Workday does. Where HiredScore had been approaching it, again, prior to the acquisition, is we had sort of looked at what is wrong with, why does some of these talent internal mobility initiatives suffer. And I go back to the data island problem for a second, and I say, well, the data says less than 20% of people updating their skills and less than 12% of people proactively looking for new roles. So right off the bat, you have a data sort of input challenge before you even get started, which is, if I'm going to get employees moving, and that's dependent on them giving me more information. And that's why you've seen other vendors emerge now that are starting to like anticipate what skills the employee might have and pre-populate those. So there's ways they're trying to solve that, but that's a fundamental issue. And so what HiredScore did is we actually took a different approach, and we said, well, in orchestration, we know actually a lot about the employee. It's just sitting in different places. So in the HCM, for instance, I know everything about what job they have, what division they're in, how long they've been in that role. And that's just their basic employee profile in every single HCM system in the world. You keep that data about your employees, right? And so from that, you can almost structure a resume even where there isn't one, or a CV even where there isn't one, because we sort of know which job they held, how long, what division, what, maybe even to some extent what skills. Okay. So that's one thing. Then I can also look at, a lot of these systems have an employee profile construct. So this is where the employee can go in, add their preferences, are they open to relocation, what skills do they have? So if that data exists, and we just said that it won't always exist, but if it does exist, I can take that. And then there's actually a third fascinating component, which is application data. So when an employee applies, like David, if you were hired by a company a year ago, we have the application from a year ago, again, within GDPR retention policies and all that. Now, also, if you're applying to new jobs, that is an intent point, and it's a new data set. So I can take all of those different information, I can kind of amalgamate that. And for most employees, that gives me an understanding of the employee. At least for everyone, I at least have their HCM data. So without asking them information, I now went from 20% to 100% of people that I can activate, essentially, at some level. So that's that right off the bat, I've got huge gains, right? And then what I can do is, what's fascinating about human behavior is, when you ask for something to give something, you get more resistance. But if you give something and then ask for something, you actually get a more interesting contribution rate. And so we're seeing that if we say, hey, employee, here's a couple of jobs we recommend that are a fit for you. And oh, by the way, if you tell us a few more things, I can even tune these recommendations more. Now you're getting better skills data. Now you're getting better other intent data. And that benefits the company as a whole, not just in this effort, but across all the other aspects of their module, right? In those, like in Workday, for example, and other areas that the manager might be looking at the employee skills based on performance reviews and whatever it may be. So now it benefits everybody. And the cool thing about that is, so we're uplifting, and so that creates a loop. So next time around, the AI has more data again, and can be more effective. And so that's one major thing. The other thing is that what I saw a lot of the solutions focus on, it goes back to that intelligence versus orchestration. So a lot of it was about, again, things like the talent marketplace. Like if I come in, or career pathing, if I come in and I put in my information, again, I had to give you the information, but if I did that, you might be able to tell me where I could move in the future. And I think that's really cool. Again, love it. It gives people kind of hope and confidence about where they can go. The problem, if practically though, is every customer I talk to says we can't figure out our workforce plans for this year, let alone the workforce plan for 3 years from now to make sure they deliver on all the roles that people wanted to move to that the system told them. So I do think you're going to see a disconnect between all these things, that what they project people can be and whether companies can deliver on that. So we're kind of focused on the here and now of like, where can they go now? What learning could they do now? What projects are available now? Because that's going to start to build the progress, and then that's going to make them more marketable for the future. So it's a little bit more of that current supply demand versus the future. I'm not saying the future isn't important, and Workday's actually got some cool technology there, but we had a sort of focused on the things that are going to deliver the outcomes, and that's moving an employee now, that so they're not moving to another company tomorrow. So the last thing that we did, and this is actually fascinating, is that we invested in post-pandemic in our collaboration platforms like Microsoft Teams. And so a big bet there, David, was if you can meet the employee where they are, we use this expression that said the new UI is no UI. And so if I can meet the employee where they are, and I don't have to ask them to go anywhere, but I can meet them, I'm also going to get a higher success rate. So you asked about success examples. We're getting right now like 1 out of 2 employees that we serve a recommendation to will apply for a job. We're seeing a 40% increase in one of our customers. I just did a case study at HR Tech and Rising with a big pharmaceutical company, and they talked about a 40% increase in internal applications as a result of launching this initiative. So now you've got the classic feedback you get from employee surveys is it's easier to apply externally than it is internally. Like it's easier to find a job, and so we're immediately solving like tangible things that are on that sort of complaint list. And then when they do get apply, we can even now, using that orchestration, alert the recruiter that a high value employee just applied so they don't get missed in the black hole. With orchestration, if they do get rejected after they interview, you could even alert their manager to say, hey, your high value employee just was rejected. And so maybe you want to consider mentorship or other recommendations, maybe learning for them. So this is where it gets really exciting because you can actually achieve those long-term business objectives. But it's not about going to another system. It's taking the data you already have, taking the information. And I'm not even getting into all the rules layers and all the stuff you can embed underneath this, the campaign types. So you can even, for instance, outreach to a redirected, impacted employee, which would be a much different message than a top performer for obvious reasons. But you want to get that right. And that's all about the message content, the experience. So long answer, but this is what we're working on.
No, really good. And, and also if you think about it, the way you were describing it, it's almost like an internal talent detective that's bringing data together from sources that are already there. And the more data you've got, I guess, in most general respects on an employee, the more relevant the recommendations will be for them. And as you said, if you're serving those up, then people are going to interact with them more and maybe fill in some of the gaps that you might have to make those recommendations even better in the future.
Well, I mean, and companies have struggled because they have those traditional like job alert systems. And, we've all gotten those over the years where you get the job alert from something and it totally misses the mark. So even there's an intent layer to the recommendation engine. So it says not only would this person be qualified, but it says if I showed them this job, would they be likely to apply? So that's going to take into account your career progression and non-traditional pathways and things like that to say, is this job not only are they qualified, relevant, would they be interested? And by the way, are they even able to move? So worst thing you can do is show somebody something that they really want that they can't move to because they're not permitted to because they haven't been enrolled long enough. So the system is even smart enough to say, are they meeting the mobility requirements to move? So that all of that's true creates a clear pathway for them for the conversion.
And all of it adds up to a better employee experience, better candidate experience. If we think about internal candidates as candidates as well, because they are. And as you said, it's arguably even more important to give a great experience to a high-performing internal candidate than it perhaps is from the outside. But a lot of the focus, particularly from talent acquisition teams, is on improving external candidate experience. And maybe what you just walked through there, Jason, helps us to actually deliver the same level of experience to internal candidates as well.
Well, I love what you just said, because even today, like we say talent acquisition, talent management, it's all one continuous talent journey, and yet they're still siloed. So again, like a lot of these talent marketplaces focus on, can I get a job recommendation to the employee? But then you've got to remember that the second they apply, they're now in a talent acquisition workflow. How does the talent recruiter even make sure that they don't miss that person? If a manager now gets the employee, how do they know that they've been passed a high value employee? These are those opportunities to really connect that experience throughout those processes and make sure nothing gets missed.
Very good. Um, so we've talked a little bit about AI, and you referenced this a little bit. But how does your approach at HiredScore ensure that the AI driving the talent orchestration remains ethical, remains safe? And I know a phrase and I know practices that Workday have been putting in, adheres to responsible AI.
Well, first of all, let me say that I think this is one of the things that made the acquisition super attractive for both parties, was that Workday had a very strong responsible AI framework ahead of it. They've touted for years their one data structure and platform, and so I think that really set us up well. Now, HiredScore, the benefit for us was that we had been in the market since 2012, pretty much the last 12 years, as a AI for HR only. So we didn't have other use cases. And I emphasize that because going back to even the examples of customers building on their own, there are so many lessons learned over 12 years and costs that went into building these models and doing it the right way. But the architecture was there from day one. And it's actually made it easy because Athena and the team build it that way. It's made it easy to adapt to a lot of the changes. So when new laws come out, we're not scrambling to figure out how we retrofit those laws into it. A lot of the framework's already there to adjust. And I can give you some examples. But I would say there's 4 kind of key tenets that we talk about in the responsible AI framework that are really important, especially with all the Gen AI, LLMs, and all things coming out. So our models actually historically are machine learning models. So we're not using typically generative AI. The reason that's important is not because Gen AI is bad, but because a lot of it's open source, you have a sort of a black box element to where did the decision come from. And so in our case, all of our models are in-house. So if we ever did identify an issue, unfortunately, that's not really the case. But if we ever did identify an issue, we would know how to solve it, derive the problem, and modify it. So that's really important when you're talking about this kind of AI use case. So that's one major thing. The second thing is that all of our AI is transparent. We talk about transparency in a couple of levels, David. So the first is the user level. So the actual AI was designed to tell recruiters, managers, whomever's interacting with it, what did we like about that relative to the job? So if we're serving a recommendation to a recruiter, we actually allow them to turn the AI inside out and see what do we like, what do we know about the job? How do we understand the structure of the job? How do we understand the CV resume? And what was their matching criteria, whether skills or experience or certifications, whatever it may be. So that it highlights those elements for them, allows them to have confidence in the decision. We also publish all of that back to the core platform for audit purposes. So the grades, the prioritization, that all goes back into the system automatically. And so the customer can run whatever analysis they'd like to. And more companies are doing that as they launch like AI COEs. And so it makes it easy for them to actually do their own analysis. The third element is actually a proprietary method that we've done. And this goes back to, I think, the danger of a lot of the methods, which is that the training set can influence bias. And so we take customer data to drive the models for rediscovery and things like that. Now, that part is fine. The challenge with the customer data set is it could have inherent bias in it. So one of the things we do, David, is something called balanced learning. So we actually use a downsampling technique to modify learning rates such that we're learning even where, for instance, not to their fault, women had applied at a lower rate than men historically, which maybe meant men were hired. We downsample so we don't learn from that characteristic in any way, shape, or form that was positively attributed in the model. Now, even though we also remove race, ethnicity, gender, nationality, any of those kind of disability data from the AI, it never touches it. We still do this as a method to ensure we're not accidentally learning a characteristic that could be attributed to any of those at-risk categories. So that's important. And then the last thing we do is everything that we're doing is fully in compliance with all regulation law. So whether it's in the US, that's the OFCCP or EEOC. In Europe, they now have the high sensitivity law. In New York, you have statewide laws now, the New York 144 law. And there's versions of these that are more privacy oriented. Some are more ethical constraint. Some are about compliance with government laws. The flavors are different, but the general themes govern somewhere around, again, this ethical or safety parameters. We've got everything built into the AI from like even opt-outs. We publish all of our findings annually on our website. We test and publish that publicly. That's actually a requirement of 144. So this is all in the background here. And again, credit to really Athena. She's dedicated about a third of her time historically to compliance, regulation, ethics, safety. So it's been a really cornerstone for us. And so it was really easy for us to make that transition to the larger Workday ecosystem with that foundation. But those are some of the kind of core elements that we're known for.
Yeah, and it's so important, isn't it? Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because there's more and more regulation coming in. So whether you're a technology firm operating in the space or whether you're an organization deploying some of this technology, it's something that we have to stay fully up to speed with and anticipate, like it sounds like you've done at HiredScore all the way through your journey to do that. And as you said, Athena, and for those listening, Athena is the CEO at HiredScore. She's spending a third of her time on that, and it is it really indicates the level of importance around this topic.
Yeah, and I think the adaptability to it as it goes on, because this is where a new law comes out and you have to now retool your whole thing to comply with that because you were taking in a data that you're not allowed to take, or you have now a requirement. So, and the other thing that we've done that, again, I think is quite cool is we take sort of the strictest interpretation. So if, for instance, OFCCP has a thing that doesn't apply in the EU, but we think it's actually the right thing for fairness and ethics, we'll still apply that globally. So another example of that was the opt-out functionality that the 144 law required, which is the candidates not only needed to know that AI was in place, but they had the right to opt out. The EU Act, for instance, doesn't require the opt-out, but we still offer it to customers, not because the law requirement, but because we actually like that ability to say, hey, we're being transparent here. We'll give you this chance. And it's actually played well for things like workers' council approvals and things like that, because it's not a requirement, but they like that it's got the same posture as like a GDPR or something like that really takes into account personal privacy and consent.
No, I really like that, because it's almost like a lot of this regulation will have, good practices that maybe could be better employed elsewhere in other jurisdictions. And it allows you to provide that more of that consistent experience for employees wherever they happen to reside within a global organization. And hopefully, in some respects, maybe even simplifies it a little bit for that organization as well, perhaps. So I like that. I think that's a nice touch.
Yeah.
Jason, moving on, in terms, we talked about outcomes, and it's about, making these insights, and helping translate them into outcomes. And one measure of outcome is obviously how we measure the effectiveness of this. So, on that topic, how can we measure the effectiveness of our talent orchestration efforts? What kind of metrics or outcomes do you typically focus on to help your clients gauge success?
Yeah. So listen, every client, as you know, from being in the space, the clients will decide. There's a lot of different things they can define, but what we've found over time is that there are generally some common categories. So it doesn't mean that these are exclusive categories. These are probably just the most common. And these aren't guarantees that I'm going to share with you, but these are like averages across the customer base. So every customer is different based on, their particular problems, challenges, timing, et cetera, data sets. But typically we would categorize the savings areas. And by the way, we don't just talk about outcomes, David, we call them iconic outcomes.
Oh, okay.
So we're trying to move the needle big time here. All right. So we talk about recruiter capacity and productivity. So again, it can be expressed different ways. At GM, they estimated that translated into 23,000 hours of FTE savings. Okay. So that was one expression of it. Another big global pharma company described it as 140% recruiter capacity increase. So they had 400 recruiters. That is now 40% better off in terms of, now what could you do with that? You could give them more recs. You could assign them more responsibility. You could have them focus on other tasks. Again, that's up to the company. We're not dictating what they do with that capacity. The third example we see is actually sort of role sort of leapfrogging, meaning like they're now thinking of what are the roles of the future. So we had one client in the airline business that said, we're going to actually take that savings and we're going to reallocate those recruiters to focus on internal mobility. So they created a career office for their employees, for example. So companies will treat the savings different ways, but the savings are inevitably about capacity and productivity that are gained from the recruiting organization. Say the second major that's kind of in that traditional recruiting talent acquisition is usually like a time to savings. And that can be expressed as like, time to review, time to manager review, time to offer. And that'll depend on which solutions they're implementing, to be honest. So if they're focused on the recruiter productivity, that might be top of funnel efficiency, mid funnel. As we get the manager the manager coach deployed, that will typically have mid funnel, late funnel impact. So time to offer starts to be impacted. So Pfizer we were on stage. They talked about a 31% improvement in time to offer as a result of the AI. So again, the expressions will look a little different, but you've got some sort of time to impact as the second major in the talent acquisition. And I'll give you a chance to answer the question, but I can highlight one or two of the mobility improvements as well.
Yeah. Good to hear about the mobility improvements as well, I think, Jason. Yeah.
Okay, so on the mobility side, you're really looking at the re-enablement of their data. So you either have external candidate rediscovery, and that has impact on candidate experience, recruitment, marketing savings, and agency savings. We had one healthcare customer in the U.S. estimate tens of millions of dollars of agency avoidance post-pandemic as a result of rediscovering talent in their own system. So that's pretty cool. And then on the internal mobility side, you've got the employee experience and sentiment as a result of what we just talked about. And then you have the increase in internal applies. So again, keeping your employees. And then you have the conversion of employee recommendations. So that's really the rate at which employees are actually moving and expressing interest in those jobs. So those are the general ones. I mean, there's a lot more. We look at all sorts of interesting things, but those are probably the most common that we talk about a lot.
Really impressive set of outcomes as well. You talked about the future, Jason. So I'm going to ask you to peer into your crystal ball a little bit now. We're coming to that time of year. Where do you see talent orchestration going in the next few years? What's the next frontier you're exploring at HiredScore? And most importantly, how can organizations start preparing now?
Well, I think what's cool is once customers start to understand how orchestration works, they actually will start to come and say, is this a good use case? And so we've had, even our roadmap starts to get furnished a little bit by our customers' ideas. But some of the areas we're excited about that are already currently talked about in the public roadmap for HiredScore and Workday, we're going to be looking at democratized succession planning. So how do you take what was typically reserved for the top 500 to 1,000 employees of big companies and make that available to any manager who wants to think about the future of their team? We're talking about recruiting managers as an interesting unlock. So there's a lot of technology for candidates, for employees, for recruiters, but the recruiting managers and the leaders are often overlooked. And I find that a lot of organizational outcomes are driven through the managers. And they're an overlooked group. And so we think the recruiting manager, talent managers, they can be a really interesting unlock. And so how could you have an AI co-pilot, coach, agent, whatever you want to call it, assisting that person better understand capacity, bottlenecks, challenges in their current team roles, whatever it may be. So we think that's interesting. Athena's got some really cool ideas on workforce planning. It's early, but now that we're part of Workday, there's so much you can do there, and every customer seems to feel like they're not successful in this area. Some really cool stuff on the contingent side. So we're starting to connect to systems like Vinly, contemplate contingent workers. Not only can we deploy the AI on top of prioritization and rediscovery there, but could you actually take somebody coming off project, move them over to in a recruiter inbox for a job that they've posted? Could you think about at the point of rec creation, is this job better suited for, a project, a contingent assignment, or is it a full-time role? So you can invert that both ways. And then there's some really cool stuff. Customers have started to come to us on agile performance management. We're hearing a lot about this, but it's difficult to achieve. And so orchestration seems like it potentially would be well designed to actually handle this agile concept, because it's really hard to build into a system and encourage the manager to always do it. But orchestration could actually be quite effective there. So these are just some of the areas. I'm probably missing a few, but I know we don't have so much time, but a lot of exciting stuff. And that's just on the HR side. Again, now that we're part of Workday, I don't know where we'll go from there in terms of some of the other components, but they have a broad AI roadmap, which you saw. And certainly, I think we'll continue to look at areas where we can connect data and types.
Yeah, and as you highlighted, you've been part of the Workday family for just a few months now, so that opens up a whole new world of possibilities and
It's exciting,
potential ways you can develop. And I share Athena's view around workforce planning. That not so many companies are still struggling with that. To be perfectly honest with you, so I think that's a good area of opportunity. So we're with the penultimate question now, Jason. So this is the question we're asking everyone on this series of the podcast. And I appreciate you might be summarizing some of the stuff you've already said in this. How can organizations use workforce data to drive culture, inclusion, and engagement?
Thanks for sharing the question. So I am going to connect it back to orchestration and I think summarize it. But I think if we think about data as the sort of connection to these culture, engagement, inclusion efforts, then I think what we would agree to is that impact is the result. Again, it goes back to this action. And so if we take the earlier supposition that orchestration is well suited to drive action, then I think what it can encourage is the right behaviors to drive the outcomes. So, for example, we're now part of Workday, so I've actually started to look at a lot of the Peakon data, which is coming from like employee sentiment surveys. So it's great to actually understand a group's sense of belonging, engagement levels, but the next step of that is actually some sort of action to respond to that. So again, we now have the employee telling us that something is good, bad, whatever it may be, and actually the Peakon data is fascinating. I'm actually finding it really valuable as a manager. But then, how do you orchestrate something off of that? Whether it's remind the manager, give the manager a warning, actually put together a plan for them on how they could prioritize these things. So it's not leaving up the manager to interpret the data, actually like process the insight, come up with the plan, action the plan. Like there's so many steps in there that sort of leave the outcome up to chance or strong change management. Either way, it's hard. But by the time everything's agreed on design, I think it's been 6 months. Nothing's changed. The employee's still dissatisfied, whatever. And I think the AI can really, really do that at scale. So that's just one example that I see practically a really cool opportunity to actually drive more engagement and actually let AI do the work for delivering the desired outcome through the orchestration.
Yeah, very interesting. And Jason, the whole conversation, I found it fascinating and really exciting. I think what you're already doing at HiredScore and Workday, and where you potentially can take this further in the future. Talent orchestration, I'm sure many of our listeners will agree, is an exciting area, I think, for us to go as HR professionals and organizations moving forward. Before we go, Jason, can you share with listeners how they can contact you on social media? Presumably LinkedIn is one of those options, and find out more about the work that you're doing at HiredScore and at Workday as well.
Yeah. So in terms of me, I'm easily contactable on LinkedIn. I'm just at Jason Scheckner. You can search me, or I think it's J Scheckner. Same on Twitter, although I'm not as active as I'd like to be there, X or whatever we call it these days. So that's at J Scheckner. In terms of if there's interest in anything we talked about related to Workday, if they're an existing customer, I highly recommend they'll just connect with their account teams. If they're a prospective customer, same process. There's a prospective teams, and they have ways that they can start to pull in. There's all wonderful solutions consultants and experts now trained on HiredScore. Certainly, they can always ask for me, and I'm happy to step into whatever I can where possible. But yeah, that's my recommendation on how to find more. And as always, this has been a really, really fun conversation.
No, I really enjoyed it, Jason. And, this episode will be published after the Unleash conference in Paris next week. But I think it will be before Workday EMEA Rising, which is in Amsterdam from the 10th to the 12th of December. I think those are the dates. And, I presume you and or some of the HiredScore team will be there.
I'll be at Unleash next week, so looking forward to seeing you there. And then yes, Athena will be back, and I will be with her on stage at EMEA Rising. So definitely look forward to connecting with yourself and others there. If any of your listeners will be there, come say hi.
Forward to it. And Jason, take care. I'll see you next week, and I'll see you in Amsterdam as well.
All right, cheers, David. Great to see you.
All right, take care.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.